Hello. Got my Brexit mug here. I'm going to speak today a bit about the UK-EU referendum campaign, because the politicians are out and about giving speeches and talking about whether we should leave the EU or not, because we're having our referendum on June the 23rd. And I'm still trying to figure out whether I should vote to leave the EU or vote to stay in. I mean, if you've watched my previous videos, you'll see that I'm leaning towards Brexit, towards leaving. But I'm not certain. I think really, for most people, the decision rests upon economic arguments. But the economic arguments are based on total unknowns, so it's like, how do you decide? I don't know. But anyway, I thought I would comment on things the various politicians have been saying during the week. And we'll start with Jeremy Corbyn. He's the leader of the Labour Party, the opposition party, the so-called Socialist Party. Or they support the workers, so they claim, and so on. He said, responsibility for many of the country's problems lies in 10 Downing Street, not in Brussels. That is, what he's trying to say is, it's the Conservative Party's fault. The Conservatives, David Cameron's Conservatives, are in power at the moment and have been for, what, 8 years, 6 years, something like that, quite a while. This is their second term in office, effectively. Consecutively, that is. So he says the responsibility for many of our country's problems lies in 10 Downing Street. It's their fault. Now I have to say, I've voted Labour in the past, I've voted Liberal Democrat, I've voted Conservative. I'm one of the don't knows, okay. But when I see statements like this, which are hypocritical, I really don't like it. He is not accepting the blame. Labour wrecked the UK's economy in the run-up to the 2008 Great Recession, or whatever it's called. They were overspending, increasing spending at a time when the economy was booming. They could have, in fact, reduced income tax or VAT to near zero levels if they had not increased their government expenditure so much, in fact, believe it or not. So I have read. Maybe it's false, but they could certainly have been saving up for the bad times, which is what Keynesian economic theory suggests you should do. In the good times, you kind of limit government spending, because you don't need to spend so much on welfare, so you cut back where it's not needed, and you save the money up, you get reserves going, you pay off the national debt. They did none of this. They increased the national debt, they carried on spending, they introduced new programmes, and then the recession hit. And oh, it's not our fault, it's a worldwide recession. America's gone into recession too, etc., etc. Well, correct, but they are still to blame for making the wrong decisions as far as this country is concerned. And it's utter hypocrisy to blame the other party for the problems we're facing economically now, which stem directly from what happened back then. It's basically lying, and I don't like it at all. Furthermore, now Jeremy Corbyn has for years and years been opposing the EU, and now suddenly he's head of the Labour Party, which is officially in favour of the EU, so he's got to support it now. And he's basically in his speeches highlighting the importance of European regulations in underpinning workers' rights, which he claims will be jeopardised by a Leave vote. Labour is supposed to be the party that supports workers and workers' rights, okay. However, Labour is in favour of mass immigration into this country from the EU, and it's immigrants who are arguably taking low-paid jobs and suppressing wages for low-paid workers. In fact, Labour even knows this, and Peter Mandelson, a Labour advisor, and I think he's working, well, he's part of the Bilderberg group, you know, has actually admitted deliberately bringing in immigrants to increase their own voter base. I'll put a link to that below, you can see it for yourself. This is a link to an article about it. It's not a primary source. It's not like him saying it directly, but I try to go for primary sources where I can, but where there's no doubt, it doesn't matter. This article is a bit better, that's all. So, Labour, the upshot of this is, by supporting this mass immigration to increase their voter base, Labour is basically undercutting their own supposed supporters. And I think what the campaigners are finding where they go door to door is they're finding a lot of opposition from Labour voters, actually. Because those are the people who are most threatened by the EU, frankly. Business people seem to do all right in the EU on the whole. He's going to say, people in this country face many problems. I think he's already said it. This is, the papers always report what they're going to say, then they report what they've said, and it's the same. People in this country face many problems, from insecure jobs, low pay and unaffordable housing, to stagnating living standards and environmental degradation, and the responsibility for them lies in 10 Downing Street, not in Brussels. Well, the responsibility lies in 10 Downing Street, and it lay there when Labour was in power too. And the mass immigration instigated by Labour is actually behind all of these problems that he's mentioned. Insecure jobs, low pay, unaffordable housing. Housing is incredible in Britain. I'll give you a bit more information on that in a bit. And he goes on to say, the Tories and UKIP are on record. UKIP is the UK Independence Party, the Tories are the Conservatives. The Tories are officially in favour of staying in Europe. Labour is in favour of staying in Europe officially. Again, many members of Parliament and ministers on either side are against. It's kind of mixed. But the parties are officially in favour of us staying in, as they have been forever, it seems. I guess they get political benefit from it. The Tories and UKIP are on record as saying they would like to cut back our workplace rights, and many unscrupulous employers would have our rights at work off us if they had the chance. Okay. I will say, though, that you won't have any workplace rights if you don't have a job, right? So bear that in mind too. I mean, the mass immigration was actually unnecessary. Immigrants do quite good things for the economy, in a way, by reducing wages and by increasing the availability of people for work. And certainly if we're bringing in qualified people and trained people, that's great. But the numbers have been so large that it's hard to build enough hospitals and schools, and we're having to pay for it in the short term, because the benefits of the immigration is only really visible over like 10 plus years. It doesn't happen like that. And in the meantime, it's causing problems. He says, instead, a Labour government will go further and work to raise employment standards throughout Europe to stop the undercutting of wages and strengthen every worker in Europe. So, listen to that. They're going to work to raise employment standards throughout Europe and stop the undercutting of wages. I can't see how it's even possible. Yes, they can work to improve worker rights in Europe and reduce the amount of business that's done. I'm sure that'll help workers. And they can stop the undercutting of wages. How are they going to do that? It's immigrants coming from places like Eastern Europe, where wages are very low in comparison to here, that are actually causing the undercutting of our wages. Are they going to stop that? No, they're in favour of it. It's complete hypocrisy. And what are they going to do? How are they going to raise the wages in Romania and countries like that anyway? You can't do it here. And Turkey, with a GDP per person of less than half that of any EU country, is about to join the EU with 70 million people who will have freedom of travel. Is he going to quadruple the wages of 70 million Turks somehow? Why doesn't he do it for us? It's utter complete nonsense. Any reforms which he manages to introduce into the EU will just have a drag on business and reduce the number of jobs, and I don't see how that will help. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me at all, that, and I think he's just saying it for the effect, basically. Meanwhile, David Cameron has been giving a nice sort of Nuremberg-style rally in the British Museum, complete with those flags looking like fasces or whatever they call them behind him. Like some historical characters have done. David Cameron, the head of the Tory party, the Conservative, he's our Prime Minister at the moment, says, "Make sure Britain is stronger, safer and better off, and vote to remain in a reformed European Union." The key word in that sentence is reformed European Union. I think almost everybody is in favour of a reformed European Union. If it actually worked well, it would be great. It's a brilliant idea. What a pity that over 40 years they haven't reformed the place. Do you think they're going to do it now? No. If we vote to leave, then maybe they'll be forced to do something. But if we vote to stay in, that will be taken as carte blanche permission to carry on as they've been going, and even rush towards ever closer union faster than ever. How could they take it to be any different? If people vote to stay in, it says, "Ah, right, it's okay then." Of course it does. Bear that in mind when making a decision, I think. I would really like the EU to stay and keep working and work better and be reformed. But by saying vote to remain in a reformed European Union, David Cameron is being a little sly. He has acquired a few little opt-outs and concessions from the EU, which are voluntary and short-term. And if you watch my video on the UK-EU referendum leaflet that the government has put out, I'll put a link below, you will see how pathetic these concessions actually are. I was hoping that the government had actually managed to do something, but no, really. There's some minor temporary changes and that's it. It's terrible. So, we've been in the European Union for some 40 years now. The European agricultural policy, their industrial policies and so on are still terrible. British industries are being wrecked by them, like the fishing industry, the coal industry, which also made an enemy of Margaret Thatcher, it has to be admitted. The steel industry of late, those are being brought down by EU regulations, in fact. In part. So, where's this reformed European Union? There isn't one. Okay, and there won't be if we vote to stay in. Britain leaving will be potentially, if we make a critical hit, it will be a near fatal blow on the EU, and they will have to reform or die if that happens. And the place is so corrupt. Their accounts haven't been signed off by the auditors for 20 years because they are below the standard of even any small little local shop. They don't even do double entry bookkeeping. Something like 95% of all expenditure is unaccounted for. Can you believe it? This is supposedly a world-class organisation, and it's chronic. Corrupt is the word. And if we're going to be remaining as a member of a corrupt organisation, it's going to bring us down too in the long run. Corruption is a reason that, say, the southern European countries have not been able to get anywhere in centuries, actually, but certainly decades. David Cameron tweeted the other day, IMF, Bank of England, OECD all forecast negative outcomes to leaving the EU. The IMF is the International Monetary Fund. The Bank of England speaks for itself. It's the official bank of the country, the lender of last resort. OECD is the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development. So they're all forecasting negative outcomes to leaving the EU. I say good, because almost all of these organisations' economic forecasts over the past 2 decades have been wrong. These are the world's most esteemed forecasting organisations. They base their forecasts on figures our governments give them, actually, for the most part. The OECD certainly does. The Bank of England does, of course. And even the IMF does when it's looking at the British economy. It takes our government's figures and our Treasury figures, and even the Treasury forecasts are wrong. All of these organisations have been almost 100% wrong in all of their economic forecasts when forecasting recessions over the past 20 or more years. They can't be taken seriously. The proof of any scientific theory, that is any theory of knowledge, if you like, comes in the predictions it makes. If those predictions come true, then you infer that the theory must be at least true enough. Okay, but since these people are making predictions which are almost universally wrong, then their theories must be wrong, or they don't have enough data, or the right sort of data. But if they're collecting the wrong sort of data, that's because their theories are wrong anyway, because they would know what to look for. So, even though it sounds very important what they say, the truth must be that they must be ignored, because they don't know what they're talking about, and that is proven by their record. Actually, even the Bible says the same thing, in case you're religious. By their fruits shall you know them. Yes, what that means is, when you're talking about a forecaster, I think that was talking about prophets, false prophets, true prophets. If what they say is true, they're a genuine prophet, right? These people haven't said a true thing almost for years. So they're false prophets, I'm afraid. Christine Lagarde is the IMF chief, very wealthy woman, claims there is nothing positive about Brexit, and she predicts plummeting house prices in Britain. Well, as I've pointed out, the IMF's International Monetary Fund's predictions are almost all wrong anyway. Okay, so this is just another one, right? It's ridiculous. Secondly, falling house prices would be good for most people in Britain in the long term, because prices in Britain are insane at the moment, absolutely beyond any measure of sanity. For example, the other day, a garage in Hammersmith and Fulham, which is central London, just off, sold. It's an 18-foot by 35-foot garage. What's that, about 5 metres by 10 metres. It sold for £466,000. That's, if you're in America, that's 700,000 US dollars, right? A garage. About as big as my bedroom, right? That's how hard it is to buy a house in Britain at the moment. I think we could do with falling house prices, don't you? People cannot get on the housing ladder, as it's called. Nobody on our typical wage of £25,000 a year can afford £466,000 for a garage, right? And I'll look at the photo. Here's the photo, right? I'll just put it up over me. That is $700,000 worth of land and property in London. It's just words fail me on that. It's just ridiculous. Okay, now, of course, if property prices do fall, maybe she's going to be right for once, and property prices will fall, and that may well, in fact, trigger a serious recession in this country if it happens. They would fall perhaps because of reduced numbers of immigrants or because of companies leaving the country. That's contradicted, in fact, by the Treasury's forecast, which predicts immigration will stay at 200,000 a year, whether we leave the EU or not. So, supposing prices do go down, that could indeed trigger a recession, because bank loans and business loans are based on or secured on property. So if the value of the property falls below the value of what you've got on loan, you have to pay off the difference. And even if, for example, you have a mortgage on your property and the value of your property falls to below the amount you've borrowed on that mortgage, you have to pay off the difference quickly. The banks usually call it in. Sometimes they can delay for a year, and if you owe them an awful lot of money, they may well rather not claim the money off you, but leave you to it, rather than have to take the house and sell it at rock bottom prices, because they'll lose more money that way. But if you owe them a smallish amount, they're likely to ask for it, because they lose less that way if you fail to pay it to them. So that will mean a lot of houses going on the market, prices falling further, and more loans going into default, and so on and so on, and businesses failing because they're having to find this money to pay the banks rather than do business. This is what happens in bad recessions and property crashes. Nobody knows whether it will happen or not. All we can say is that these people's forecasts have been almost always wrong. And so it's just scaremongering, basically. It might happen, it might not. There are plenty of arguments to say that British people would be better off if we left financially. We'd be better off because, for example, tariffs on food imports at the moment raise prices by between 8 and 18%. So we could expect a fall in import prices. And the pound itself is likely to decline because investors will be scared of what's going to happen to Britain when we leave. And that would reduce our export prices, and it may raise import prices. So all these effects could be happening at once. And nobody knows which is going to be the stronger effect. We could find ourselves actually better off fairly soon if the pound falls enough to cancel out the rise in tariffs we might have to meet against the EU if they start to impose tariffs on us. So it's all a big don't know, and the answer is chaos, basically. Whatever sort of chaos it is, it's likely to be fairly short-lived, because businesses and the government will adapt to the circumstances and change the rules and make negotiations and make it work. Britain is the 5th largest economy in the world. We have clout, even with the EU. And although they export only about 3 or 4% of their exports to us, most of the stuff is coming from places like Germany. Okay, and they are going to want to negotiate. They don't want to penalise their own car industries and people like that who are exporting large amounts of stuff to us. So overall, we can probably get a deal. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And in terms of falling house prices, Ian Duncan Smith, who's the former Work and Pensions Secretary, resigned from the government. He says that EU membership is destroying young people's dreams of getting onto the property ladder. Well, yeah, when you think the house prices are so high in London in particular because of the large numbers of wealthy immigrants coming in from Europe. We have lots of poor immigrants coming in from Europe, but we have lots of wealthy immigrants coming in too for the top jobs and investing here. And it's pushing up prices beyond all recognition, like that garage, £466,000. I suppose they're going to turn it into a flat. An apartment, as that is in America. But really, it's not possible for most people to get a place in London anymore. Most ordinary people. There's another angle, actually, on this. The MP Owen Paterson has said, If we vote to remain, we will be consigning ourselves to being a colony of an EU superstate with more integration and increasingly diminished British influence. I have to say, as I've said earlier in this vlog, I kind of see the same thing. If we vote to stay in, it's effectively permission for the EU to carry on as it has been. There will be no ability for us to put pressure on them to reform. So ever closer union will go ahead if we vote to stay in. And although David Cameron has negotiated an opt-out, the next government is not bound by that. The next government is likely to be Labour. 50-50 chance in this country. And they would almost certainly opt back into the ever closer union ideal. They are very much in favour of all the business rights and or workers' rights, as they call it, especially with Jeremy Corbyn as the leader. I mean, Tony Blair was a different kettle of fish, really, but Jeremy Corbyn is a traditional, old-fashioned socialist type, and he would favour the big bureaucracy and ever closer union and getting rid of Britain's sovereignty. They are largely opposed to British sovereignty, the Labour Party, for all their... They always talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk at all. And as I've mentioned earlier, they're undermining their own voter base significantly, and I just hope people notice what they're doing, really. They're the most cynical party in British politics at the moment. Now, I mentioned the Treasury Forecast earlier. The Treasury's warned that every household could be £4,300 worse off after a Brexit. I think this is in about 10 years' time. Okay. Now, the Bank of England has actually pointed out that nobody can forecast that far ahead with any accuracy, and we all know they can't even forecast next year with any accuracy. But it's worth pointing out that this is based on a lot of unproven assumptions. They've assumed that we could not organise a free trade agreement with the EU. I mean, including services in particular, like insurance and stuff, banking. And yet South Korea has managed to negotiate that, so why couldn't we? It assumes that trade barriers will go up, but they might not, because, as I've mentioned, Germany, for example, exports quite a high proportion of its exports to Britain, and so does France. They are not going to want to punish their own industries. The amount that the EU as a whole exports to Britain is not that high in percentage terms. It's something like 86 billion a year or something, but in percentage terms it's not very high. It's about, I don't know, 4%, something like that. I'm not sure of the figure. It's not much, but when you look at the particular main exporting countries, it's quite a high proportion of their exports. So they are not going to want trade barriers to go up, I would argue. Also, it's worth pointing out, as I did just now, Treasury forecasts are usually wrong. Okay, and they're even worse the further in the future they look. And they produced a number of scenarios, and that was the worst possible scenario that they chose. And actually, the Bank of England, which also normally makes its forecasts incorrectly, contradicts the Treasury forecast with one of its own, which says that wages for the lowest paid will actually go up if we were to leave the EU. So, I'm still clearly in favour of Brexit, I think. So far, I'm not convinced by any of this. What do you think? Do you think I'm getting it wrong? Why would there be a recession? And if there is a recession, would it be a bad thing? I mean, in the short term, obviously it would be a bad thing. But in the long term, would it really matter? We're due a recession anyway. We get one every 8 or 9 years, no matter what, almost. So we're kind of due one anyway. And nobody knows why they happen and how to get around them. The country's debt is still far too high. We're likely to remain in debt as long as we're a member of the EU because we have a permanent trade deficit with them. and EU regulations in fact increase some of our expenses, government expenses. We've been running deficits for the last 20 years or so, since the mid-80s I think, because of the EU, and that's not going to change, is it? It's undermining us permanently, gradually. I don't know. At the moment the polls seem to be suggesting that there's a small majority in favour of staying in the EU. I do think if that happens it's really the end of Britain and British sovereignty, ultimately, unless of course the EU collapses anyway. It might. It's failing to resolve its own internal issues, of course, because it's incapable of reform. So maybe even if we vote to stay in, it won't turn out to be so bad, except that we will suffer from the collapse of the EU directly, being a member of it as well. Well, what do you think? I'm interested to see what you have to say. Okay, bye for now.